All right, let's talk about the championship game. 52-24 final, 14 all second quarter. Of course, Trey Sermon goes down the first play of the game. Wyatt Davis, arguably the best offensive lineman on the team, goes down mid-second quarter. And those seem to be the two losses. Obviously, Tommy Togiai in the middle with Haskell Garrett never stepping on the field, of course, against Alabama. The Crimson Tide had their issues as well from a health standpoint, but I don't know if they missed the key components like that. So just your thoughts about this coming from you, but also what you gather from the players and from Ryan Day in regards to, was this wasn't our best on Monday night. We feel good where we are, the program, the trajectory, or this might have been a little slap in the face, wake up call that we need to get better as a program.
I think it's a combination of the two, and leaning more towards we need to get better. I think we'll look back on this college football season and think, instead of there being maybe Alabama and Clemson and then Ohio State and everyone else, it was, and I think that was the thought throughout much of the year. It was more Alabama and then everyone else. And I think you saw what Ohio State was able to do to Clemson, and then what Alabama did to Ohio State, what Alabama did to Notre Dame. And it just clearly looks like maybe Alabama wasn't the best team week 1 and week 2, week 3. There were some times when they had some issues, but by the end of that season, Nick Saban had that team operating on all cylinders, 100%. And I don't know if there was a team out there that was going to win that game. Now, I do think if Ohio State has a full strength squad to take the field and doesn't lose those guys you mentioned during the game, then maybe the scoreline is a little different. Trey Sermon going out obviously affected what the Buckeyes were going to do schematically. I mean, you saw this offense just change into a completely more balanced, you don't know where they're coming from type of offense when you had an explosive running back in the backfield that was consistent and better than consistent, frankly, with what he was able to do the last 3 games in Trey Sermon. Master Teague came in and played well. He scored 2 touchdowns, rushed for over 60 yards, but he just doesn't have that explosive factor. He doesn't see the holes as well as Sermon, who's a senior. So that certainly hurt. Losing Wyatt Davis right before halftime, obviously a negative. That's a unanimous All-American, but at that point, a lot of the damage was already done. But Tommy Togiai is the other guy you mentioned. That was probably the biggest loss for Ohio State, just because he was so good all year as a guy in the middle of that defensive line for Ohio State, alongside Haskell Garrett, stopping the run, getting pressure on quarterbacks. You saw this defensive line really come to life against Clemson and get a lot of pressure, and Tommy Togiai is at the heart of that. And so when he's not able to play, Tyreek Smith as well, who played very well against Clemson as a defensive end, you lost a lot on that defensive line, and the guys that were in there, aside from maybe Jonathan Cooper, weren't able to get that same kind of production. So, I don't think that Ohio State ends up beating Alabama if those guys are in there. I think it probably would have taken a perfect game with everything going right. As you mentioned, Alabama had a few guys out, Jalen Waddle even, trying to play, Devonta Smith leaving the game just after halftime. And it's incredible the numbers he put up in just a half of football. It was just everything was working right for Alabama in that game. And that's, credit to the Crimson Tide. And I think the Buckeyes now have seen it firsthand. This was Ryan Day's first time coaching a national championship game. Now you know what a national championship team looks like. And I think now, instead of having that chip on your shoulder because you lost to Clemson in a game you thought you should have won like they did a year ago, now you have, okay, this is how much harder we have to work to get to that level. You've seen it. Now you've got to get there.
It wouldn't have made a difference in the win-loss column, but it would have been interesting also to see Justin Fields at 100%. Unfortunately, for 2 consecutive playoffs, we see him compromised. And this time around, it was the drive in which Garrett Wilson caught the touchdown, and there was little or no hope, but it gave him a glimpse of hope. 38-24 after Wilson scores the touchdown. There's about 9 minutes left, and it's 2 scores. So it's manageable, not the way they're playing defense and not stopping Alabama, but if you just look at score and time, it's doable. 9 minutes left, 2 touchdown deficit. And on that drive, that's really the first time Fields, they gave him a couple designed runs. He broke free for like 30 or 35 yards on one of them, ended up being the leading rusher, even with sacks included. and you just got a glimpse. And of course, they didn't want to expose him for 15 to 18 carries in a game. But what it could have been offensively with him, let alone Trey Sermon, of course.
Yeah, I don't know if Ohio State fans ever really saw the complete Justin Fields. Last year when we talked about this a lot, they didn't want to expose him to a ton of running because they didn't have the depth behind him at quarterback. They didn't want that injury. And then he gets injured against Penn State, but is able to keep playing. And as you mentioned, when goes into the playoff with the knee injury and wearing a brace on his knee, and he wasn't 100% in that game. And this year, for the start of the season, didn't have to do a ton of running. Ohio State was just overmatching opponents. And, maybe the closest thing Ohio State fans ever saw of Justin Fields on the ground was against Michigan State in what ended up being the last game of the regular season, where with a number of offensive linemen out, he had to kind of use that ability to move in the pocket and run and whatnot to kind of get the offense going. But, I think that Clemson game was obviously great performance-wise from a passing perspective, but, he was never really used as a dual threat quarterback. And I think some of that was by design. I think it was use it if you need to type of thing. Ryan Day comes from an offense where you don't necessarily run the quarterback, but it certainly would have been interesting to see Justin Fields on the biggest stage against a top team, being able to do everything that's in his arsenal, throwing the ball, running the ball, all of that. And Ohio State fans never really got a chance to see that. So that is unfortunate, but like you said, I'm not sure it would have ultimately made a difference in terms of who won that game on Monday night.
Had they won the national championship, I think Justin Fields vaults to the top of Ohio State quarterback boards all time when you think about winning the ultimate, combined with winning record, combined with statistics, combined with top end talent. Where if you look at the Ohio State national championships over the last 50 years, you got Craig Krenzel and you've got Cardell Jones, a backup quarterback. So that's not the reason they won the championship, while the top end guys, Haskins, Troy Smith, and now Justin Fields, weren't able to get that ultimate prize. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Pat Murphy's on the line, joining us to talk Ohio State football as he does on a regular basis. And we always enjoy the conversation and insight from Pat. You can join him on Bucknuts 247 Sports. You see it right there on the banner. Shaun Wade had a curious career at Ohio State. He came in highly touted. He played extremely well by many accounts. He was in a particular role. And then he has the play that many point to as being the demise of the team against Clemson. Not necessarily his fault, just making a play, called for targeting, leaves the game, leaves the defense exposed. Then comes back the next season heroically in some ways to not only just come back to offer his athleticism, but to help the push to get football back in the Big Ten. He and his family. Then doesn't necessarily have the best of seasons, despite some of the accolades that seem a bit curious as well in terms of All-American status. So Shaun Wade makes his decision known today to move on to the NFL. And your thoughts about Shaun Wade?
It's an interesting career, because when Shaun Wade was recruited, and I wrote about this on Friday a little bit, sort of about his legacy with Ohio State and in Buckeye fans. But as a recruit, he was a 5-star prospect, the number 2 prospect in his class, or the number 2 cornerback in his class, only behind Jeff Okudah, who obviously had a great Ohio State career and is now with the Detroit Lions. Okudah goes in, plays some as a true freshman, gets his feet wet, whereas Wade gets hurt, redshirts that year, comes back as a redshirt freshman the next year, and is used some at corner, but mostly at safety. Doesn't really find that position until 2019. As you mentioned, he was in a slot corner spot and really did well there. And when he did announce last January that he was coming back, the expectation was, okay, he will move into that Okudah role as the number 1 cornerback, and things will continue as they did in 2019, and that just didn't happen. And I think there's a number of reasons you could point to. I think the lack of an off season to really work on things and really refine being an outside corner, because it's not the same as when you're covering in the slot. There's just a lot different from that position. I think that affected him. I think not having some of those early season non-conference games where maybe he makes that mistake or two, but you can go back and clean that up on film as opposed to going straight into Big Ten game after Big Ten game after Big Ten game. And then, like everybody this year, the choppiness of Ohio State's season didn't help. I think getting into a rhythm for all of these guys was tough. But I mean, let's be clear. Shaun Wade was a disappointment this year, and a guy that probably could have gone and been maybe a late first round, early second round pick. I think that the highest he probably goes is in the second round, unless one team in the NFL just looks at him and says, okay, he's got all the physical tools. He comes from Ohio State. Yes, there's stuff to clean up, but we're willing to bet on the pedigree and the natural ability, the skill sets, and takes him in the first round. But I definitely think he hurt himself, especially with these recent performances. Even in the win against Clemson, Cornell Powell, a receiver who had a very good year, but a guy who hadn't really done much at Clemson until this year, just torched Shaun Wade time after time. And some of that was schematically. They were playing Shaun Wade off a little bit, and Clemson just took the 8 yards, and then Cornell Powell was able to sometimes make it into a bigger gain. And then obviously you saw what happened in the national championship with Ohio State secondary in general. But I think Shaun Wade will probably be viewed as this player who never lived up to the hype by Buckeye fans, especially with the way this season ended, which I'm not sure is entirely fair. I do think he was very good in 2019. And as you said, if he stays in that Clemson game, maybe it's a little bit different. But, it's just, what have you done for me lately? And at the end of his career was not what he wanted it to be. And, now he goes off to the NFL. And one way you can make it up to Buckeye fans is represent Ohio State well in the NFL. There are guys, Bradley Roby is a guy I think of a lot that was a Ohio State cornerback that kind of struggled his last year. A lot of people thought he was just going through the motions and wasn't sure why he came back. But he goes to the NFL and has been a fairly productive corner. And I think Ohio State fans are glad every time he says, Bradley Roby, Ohio State on Monday Night Football. So that's another way that Shaun Wade can kind of make up for things down the road.
Yeah, definitely. That's a connection that a lot of college fans don't have, but most do, I think. They want to see their players move on. And when they spit out the name on the primetime games, to be able to say it proudly and have everyone, certainly Michigan fans feel better about Tom Brady today, even though he had a nice career there. But, he wasn't the greatest quarterback of all time 20 years ago, certainly. All right, Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts 247 Sports. Pat, what's our tote board stand at in regards to NFL departures? Anybody else we need to hear from? Of course, we just talked about Shaun Wade in particular.
Yeah, there are a number of guys that I think are almost certainties to go. Obviously Shaun Wade already made his announcement, but Wyatt Davis, like Shaun Wade, declared before the Big Ten came back this year. So I expect him to go, again, a unanimous All-American, doesn't have much to come back for. Justin Fields seems to me to be a guy that is going to go. There have been rumors, or buzz, I guess I should say, that he is giving more consideration to coming back than a lot of people expected. I still expect that he will depart, and that was made even stronger today when Urban Meyer listed, as I mentioned, the top quarterbacks in the draft and included Justin Fields. So if he knew something about Justin Fields not coming back, I think he probably wouldn't have used his name. But I think more likely than not, Justin Fields goes. But I do think, the way that the season ended, he's not entirely happy with that, and is at least giving some consideration to possibly coming back. Chris Olave, a guy who is likely to go as well. His career ended, or if this was the end of his career, it ended well in terms of production and what he was able to do these last couple games. And then there's kind of fringe guys that, probably could go, but would probably benefit from coming back. Cornerback Sevyn Banks, defensive end Tyreek Smith, who I mentioned earlier, Josh Proctor, the safety who started this year, defensive end Tyler Friday. Does Tommy Togiai go? Tight end Jeremy Ruckert, who played very well, especially in these two playoff games. So I think there's probably 4 or 5 guys that you would be surprised if they came back, and then some other guys that would certainly be surprised if they left. But this day and age, I think it's hardly ever a surprise when someone declares. And then there's the guys that can come back for an additional senior year because of the NCAA rule that this year basically doesn't count against eligibility. Ohio State's cornerback Marcus Williamson announced in the build-up to one of the playoff games, I forget which one, that he was already coming back despite being a senior. Only started really this year. And then, the other name I'm going to be interested to see is if Haskell Garrett decides to come back. Again, he's another guy, a senior who really only started this one season, played very well, was named a first-team All-American by a couple of different outlets, but only 8 games as a starter at Ohio State. If he comes back for another year, is productive as expected, then I think he could really boost his draft stock, maybe even to a first-round level guy. So, there's a lot of guys we're keeping an eye on. I check Twitter and Instagram often to see if these guys have posted anything, because you never know where they're going to announce. You've got to be on the alert, because if they put it out and you're not paying attention, it's bad news.
Yes. God bless you guys like you, Pat, having to keep track of all that. The social media accounts, where it was more traditional years ago, but now you got to track all these guys. And I don't want to give Ohio State fans false hope, but if Justin Fields returns, then that completely, you go from, there's still the odds-on favorite in the Big Ten. They're still so much more talented than everyone else, but it goes from we should win the Big Ten to let's not even really consider seriously national championship playoff. Let's see how it goes, to, oh, let's take another run at this. Like, you're talking about a game-changing, season-changing kind of possibility there.
Yeah, well, the one thing I will say, and I don't think anyone should be disappointed if Justin Fields comes back. As you just said, that changes the whole spectrum of expectations. But if you look at what Ohio State has, is 2 freshman quarterbacks now, both high 4-star guys. Another 5-star kid coming in Kyle McCord, who will be here in a matter of days here in January. So those guys are looking at, okay, next year is the year I get to go. Now, if Justin Fields comes back, there's a good chance you lose at least one of those, probably one of the freshman guys that decides to transfer. So you are risking a little bit of your future if Justin Fields comes back. But as you mentioned, the payoff could be, you're playing for another national championship in a year from now. So I do think there's kind of a fine line, and this is something coaches have to work with these players at the end of the year about, because at a school like Ohio State, when you're bringing in top talent after top talent, the expectation is, okay, guys are going to move on. And if, one guy doesn't kind of follow that trajectory or that plan that everyone kind of had in the back of their mind, now it's so easy to jump in that transfer portal. The NCAA gives out waivers like they're candy on Halloween. And, a guy like CJ Stroud, who Ohio State fans are very excited about, could end up elsewhere playing football next year. So, just something to think about in terms of the Justin Fields stuff. I do think he probably makes the decision to go to the NFL. You don't have to worry about it. And as you said, if he comes back, you're in very good shape as a team, especially offensively. But, you do kind of have to always have in the back of your mind, how does this impact the future? And that is one possible small downside, I guess.
Another big reason to keep it locked in at 247 Sports, Bucknuts with Pat and the rest of the staff there. Again, bucknuts.com. You see it right there, 247 Sports, and right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Pat, it's always a pleasure.
Yep. Thank you. I enjoy it.